America Looks Abroad with your foreign correspondent, Robert Arden, presented each weeknight over these stations by the 12 Southern California offices of Dr. Cowan, the friendly credit dentist, whose main Los Angeles office is over the Owl Drug, 5th and Broadway. Tonight's broadcast is transcribed from an earlier program.
Good evening. New Year's Day has come and gone. And while we are getting accustomed to writing 1941 in our datelines, 1940 A.D. is being entered into the records of history as a year which saw the most important and perhaps the most far-reaching ideological conflict of modern history break out in open warfare. The term ideological conflict is being used advisedly, since it cannot be doubted any longer that the war between Great Britain and Nazi Germany is not an armed contest between two powerful nations disputing each other's possessions, but that it is actually a life-and-death struggle between two ideologies. Let us see if my contention stands up under close scrutiny. On one side, we have Great Britain, her ally and sympathizers. They obviously stand for preservation and protection of their traditional belief in human liberty and spiritual freedom. On the opposing side, we have Nazi Germany and her totalitarian axis, the advocates of imposition by brute force of a dogma that teaches intolerance, subservience of all to one individual, and which excuses aggression and bloody conquest as the rightful means to their end employed by supposed members of a super race. Those are unquestionably the facts in the case. The bitterness which marks the current conflict, both on the battlefields and on the speakers' platforms, the hateful use of treacherous espionage and insidious propaganda, that alone would point to the existence of an ideological conflict rather than to a clash caused by more material motives. It is a well-known and perhaps somewhat unfortunate fact that human beings, when inspired by inflexible ideas, and by that are meant all ideas whose inherent weakness disallows tolerance or any other form of peaceful conciliation, are apt to transgress beyond the limits of human kindness and resort to more or less bloody violence. That psychological fact was proved by the ancient Romans during the times of early Christianity. It was demonstrated by Mohammed. It was again brought into evidence by the Holy Inquisition, and it is being repeated in our times by communism, fascism, and Nazism. Philosophy teaches us that we can learn from our past. By establishing indisputable facts at certain intervals, we can discern directional lines which indicate at least the direction in which certain events under certain conditions will and must lead. The history of mankind shows that in certain circumstances, usually under great economic stress and the ensuing mental despair, human beings are willing to follow almost any leader who promises a better future. Whether that be paradise after this life, or nirvana, or the promised land, whether it be the Marxian utopia or the Hitlerian Nazi domination, makes essentially no difference. When in need, human beings learn to pray. When in despair, they like to follow a stronger mind. Taking these facts for granted, we must now look at Europe and seek out the material confirmations. After the last European war, in 1918, there was great economic distress and great mental despair all throughout Europe. Russia, though the first nation to embrace, more or less willingly, the new religion of communism, after 20-odd years of practical and unlimited experimenting, is still as far away from the Marxian utopia or any other ideal condition, for that matter, as it ever was. Then came the multitude of new states, created by strategists on the conference tables of Versailles, in strict accordance with the proclaimed principle of self-determination, but without any regard for economic possibilities. These states, of course, had nothing more than a different language, and very often only a different dialect as a justification for their political existence. Small wonder, then, that their political existence was a heavy economic burden and a continuous source of friction with their neighbors and sponsors. Italy was second to attempt a change, when a renegade socialist by name of Benito Mussolini double-crossed his spiritual and material leader, Gabriele D'Annunzio, and set himself up as Duce del Fascismo. The intolerance of that new political religion was demonstrated in, as we saw later, the comparatively mild form of beatings and castor oil treatments of dissenters. Germany, the strongest and most important of the European nations, went through every one of the disappointing experiences her neighbors had to muddle through. Post-war Germany had her communist putschs and fascist coups d'etat under the social democratic governments which followed a collapsed imperial regime. But while excellent as a position in a parliamentary monarchy, the Social Democrats proved themselves utterly devoid of any ability to assume leadership of the new state. In those circumstances, under those conditions, covered by comparative obscurity, a former paperhanger, a hysterical egoist who had an axe to grind with everyone and everything, became the underground apostle of countless hungry and jobless Germans whose worst suffering came from their hurt pride. The German, or rather the Prussian, who has no racial affinity with the Teutonic German at all, since he is originally a Slav, is deeply rooted in his past, which shows his ancestors as conquering warriors. Hitler's task was comparatively easy, inasmuch as the Germans were mentally and materially ready to follow a new leader, provided he would lead them back to the glory that once was theirs. Before going any further, let's have a word from Bill Fuller.
More than simply marking a date on the calendar, New Year's is traditionally a day in which resolutions are made, as we all know. So if you have made a list of good intentions, a list of the many things you plan to do this year and had intended doing last year, suppose we check over the items to see whether you have remembered one of the most important. See if you have resolved to have your teeth cared for by Dr. Cowan, the friendly credit dentist. Neglected teeth can cause great misery, can cause ill health, too. And neglected teeth can be a source of discomfort, both mental and physical. You can't represent yourself to your best advantage if poor teeth misrepresent you. So why not resolve right now to start 1941 the right way by having your teeth properly cared for? Such care is simple and conveniently obtained by calling on your nearest Dr. Cowan Friendly Credit Dental office. You needn't delay further because of lack of cash or heavy Christmas expenditures, because Dr. Cowan will not ask you to pay cash. You may arrange terms to suit your own budget, and there is never an extra charge for Dr. Cowan credit. And speaking of terms, with approved credit, it is not necessary to have a down payment to have Dr. Cowan fit you with a set of the improved transparent material dentures, the still recent development of dental science that has brought untold relief and comfort to wearers of artificial teeth. If you haven't learned of the advantages of these new dentures, I'd suggest that you ask Dr. Cowan to show you samples on your next visit. And I'd suggest, too, that you make that dental visit early in 1941. How about seeing Dr. Cowan, the friendly credit dentist, tomorrow? The main office over the Owl Drug, 5th and Broadway, downtown Los Angeles. And now back to Robert Arden.
That was the way the theory of Nazi Superman was born and the idea of world conquest conceived. The world does not acknowledge the glorious past of the Teuton and his inherited claim to greatness, so the Nazis argued. The world must be taught by force. And once in power, the Nazi doctrine became the most ruthless and intolerant of all. Human beings became the servants of the state and the serfs of their master. Religion of any denomination became outlawed, and concentration camps, or the far more merciful end of sudden death, became the destiny of all those who were singled out as responsible for the depressed economic and political situation. Agreements and treaties were torn up, and since the rest of the world did not feel much desire to embark upon another devastating war, the leader, their Führer, became the hero in the eyes of his hypnotized followers, and Nazism was on the march. Thus we see that the facts are there. Need, starvation, and mental despair are the components which created the monster of Hitlerism. And from those facts we can determine those directional lines I mentioned before, and they seem to point to ultimate destruction of Hitler and his Nazism, because essentially human beings want to be free to think, speak, and worship as they please. They want to see their children grow up as free men and not become products of mass industry destined to serve as uniformed slaves in a military juggernaut. A Washington report tonight tells of an exchange of telegrams between the King of Italy and President Roosevelt. Most of the papers buried that item in their back pages, although, in my opinion, it is one of the most interesting, perhaps most revealing stories that has come to our attention. King Vittorio Emanuele sent President Roosevelt a message in which he extended his most cordial good wishes for the people of the United States. At the same time, the fascist press was threatening a declaration of war upon the same people by the totalitarian Axis. Now the question arises, which one of the two represents the public sentiment of the still fascist state of Italy? Mussolini has never been able successfully to overcome the great influence of the Italian king upon the Italian people. He was forced to keep the king a virtual prisoner within the walls of the Quirinale. Now, suddenly, the king, apparently without the consent of his prime minister, communicates with the president of a country which the official fascist press accuses of trying to become essential in an attempt to defeat them and their political allies. That would indicate that the vast majority of Italians stand behind their king and not with Mussolini and his fascists, and that the so far terrifying domination of the Italian people by the fascists is gradually diminishing in violence. And that would be a fact which, if true, would foreshadow the possibility of an early collapse of fascism. The king, who would naturally become the leader of his people again, would then have at least the full sympathies of this country with him. And that's not such a bad start for any politician. President Roosevelt, in his fireside chat, referred shortly to the fact that he believed in the defeat of the Axis, partly because he was in possession of excellent information. It wouldn't be beyond all possibilities to assume that the same man who sends the President and the people of the United States a friendly New Year's wish could also be the source of reliable and friendly information. But be that how it may, it cannot be denied that the impression of fascism's growing weakness is greatly underlined by the Italian king's unexpected entrance on the international stage.
While Robert Arden reviews a few final comments, may I remind you that for all dentistry at any time with no charge for credit, the offices of Dr. Cowan, the friendly credit dentist, are located in 12 communities from Ventura to San Diego, including Long Beach, opposite Bufham's Broadway at Pine, and East Los Angeles, Whittier, the corner of Kern. The main Los Angeles office in the Metropolitan Building, 5th and Broadway, over the Owl Drug. For approximate prices in advance, telephone Mutual 1191. And here are more remarks by Robert Arden.
Another highly significant report came from Lisbon, the capital of Portugal, tonight. According to well-informed sources there, the diplomatic relations between Nazi Germany and the Vichy government were close to formal rupture as the negotiations over Laval's reinstatement into the French government were suddenly broken off. It is quite obvious that the Franco-German relations have grown steadily worse since the break between Marshal Pétain and Pierre Laval. Hitler was able to force the Pétain government to release Laval from arrest, but he could not make the aged French warrior take him back into the government. Now, if an open break between Nazi Germany and France occurs, there are two results possible. First, Pétain may fly to North Africa and leave the rest of European France to Laval and Hitler. Or, secondly, he may stay and accept the consequences of a Hitler appointment of Laval as head of a totalitarian France. In that latter case, Weygand, the Generalissimo in North Africa, may have the last word. And it can be assumed that he would not say hello to either Hitler or Laval, but perhaps prefer to greet the British with a hearty bienvenue. Weygand still controls France's most powerful North African army, and if he joins Britain, Italy's collapse in Libya would become a matter of a few hours only. And if Berlin breaks with Pétain, Weygand will have no other way. At any rate, it becomes more and more apparent now that Hitler is not quite at ease, even in conquered France. And as long as that question remains unsolved, it will remain highly dangerous for him to venture any other military expedition on the Balkans. It may be much more difficult than he or even Monsieur Laval expects to impose the Nazi doctrine upon the French people, who by their very nature would rather shout, "Vive la liberté, égalité and fraternité," than yell, "Heil Hitler." The ideological conflict between Nazism and democracy will be hard and bitterly fought. But like the famous prize fighter, we all know, the day will come when a free humanity will shout, "It was a tough battle, O Lord, but we won." Au revoir.
Each evening, Monday through Friday, America Looks Abroad with your foreign correspondent, Robert Arden, a radio feature presented over these stations by Dr. Cowan, the friendly credit dentist. Until tomorrow evening, at our regular time, 7:45, this is Bill Fuller reminding that you can never afford to neglect your teeth when you can always afford to see Dr. Cowan. Tonight's broadcast was a transcription of a program heard earlier this evening. This program originates in Warner Brothers Hollywood Studios.
Be sure with Pure. The Pure Oil Company again presents H.V. Kaltenborn. It's Scoop. In the newspaper world, it's the Scoop. The exclusive stories that make a good newspaper a great newspaper. Good reporters, star reporters. In the motoring world, it's the exclusive carbon-fighting chemical combination that makes solvanized Pure Pep, the solvanized Local Pep, the outstanding stars among all the good gasolines on the market. Pure Oil scoops the field with this chemical combination that works as you drive to keep your motor cleaner and fresher. Better gasoline to begin with, Pure Oil solvanized gasoline is still the only motor fuel with this exclusive extra to help rid your motor of excess carbon and bring out its pickup, power, and performance. Yet for this extra benefit, you pay no extra money. Pure Oil's solvanized Pure Pep and Local Pep sell at the price of regular. Doesn't that make sense to you as another reason to buy this gasoline? Just as 2 and 2 make 4, good gasoline plus something extra means more value for your gasoline money. The way to prove it is to try it in your own car. Now, Kaltenborn edits the news.
Good evening, everybody. I have come to Washington to see the start of the new Congress tomorrow and on Monday, when it will be addressed by the President. The House of Representatives of the 76th Congress round up its business today. The Senate will meet again tomorrow morning, establishing a record session of 367 days. The new Congress will probably spend $10 billion for defense and will impose record taxes and do other things to prevent inflation. Speaker Rayburn and Representative McCormick, the majority leader of the House, conferred with the President today, and the President outlined to them the message he will deliver in person on Monday. And when Speaker Rayburn tells us, as he does, that this message will be very interesting, we can easily believe him. It will outline the President's plan to lend and lease war materials to Britain, in addition to many other interesting subjects. 4 projects totaling $70 million were announced today by the War Department. The significant thing about all 4 is that each one provides not for manufacturing war material, but once completed, these plant extensions will provide for an enormous increase in our capacity to produce airplane engines, frames, and superchargers. The dominant purpose in Washington today is to speed production. Everyone here seems to feel the need for speed. And while there is a limit to what we can produce during the next 6 months, we are rapidly expending the limits of what we can produce during the 6 months after that. But why should Hitler wait with his all-out effort until the United States has reached the point of full production? More and more people in Washington are beginning to feel that the lease and lend policy must be applied to war material now on hand. They believe that the planes, destroyers, and merchant ships we let Britain have between now and May will be more important than all those we manufacture for her during the balance of the year. I had an opportunity today to discuss America's foreign policy with one of the men who helped make it. There are only half a dozen men in Washington who occupy key positions in foreign affairs. At the present time, they are working together much more closely than is necessary in the piping times of peace. And I won't quote to you exactly what one of these 6 men said, because I believe it gives a fair idea of the general administration attitude. I am neither an isolationist nor an interventionist. I believe in giving all help to Britain that can be justified under the rules of international law or an observance of sound conduct in relations among nations. We cannot violate the rules of decency among nations as the Axis powers have done. As to how much we can give in planes, destroyers, war materials, without jeopardizing the interests of the United States and of our own defense, I don't know. I will allow myself to be guided by the opinions of military experts. They know, and I do not. As for credit, I believe we must help Britain whether she can or cannot pay for that aid. We cannot wait until Britain's cash and security resources are exhausted. She must be able to make commitments long in advance. I do not favor repeal of the Neutrality Act or of the Johnson Act, although the two are not exactly on the same footing. The essential thing for us is to keep our policy flexible. We must be in a position to respond to new developments. One thing is certain. We cannot permit threats on the part of the Axis powers to influence our policy. We should not do anything that would justify them in declaring war on us. But we should not be deterred from doing what we think right by the fear that they might declare war on us. And we must follow a firm policy towards Japan as well as towards Germany and Italy. We cannot permit Japan to move towards Singapore or the Dutch East Indies without taking immediate retaliatory action. And we must continue to help China with loans and missions. But fundamentally, our peace and our well-being will depend on the state of our defense. I don't see any danger of military invasion for our generation or the next. But I do see danger of a situation so difficult that in time we would prefer open war to the continuation of a precarious peace. The next 4 months will bring important new developments. We must be ready to meet them as they arise. And for the moment, our best hope of peace lies in what American industry can produce. There is one thing in which I am disappointed. We really know comparatively little of what is actually going on in Europe in a political or military way. Censorship hides much. But I sometimes wonder if it doesn't hide more than it ought to be permitted to hide to our eyes. Thus speaks a key man in the administration intimately related to the conduct of our foreign affairs. William Allen White resigned today as active chairman of the Committee to Defend America by aiding the Allies. Many people believe that Mr. White resigns because he does not want to go quite as far in helping the Allies as some of the other members of his committee. He did not wish the United States to send American merchant ships or warships into the war zone. He is primarily concerned with keeping America out of war. Some members of his committee are urging American naval convoys to make sure that American supplies reach British ports. The question is still academic because there is no evidence that this administration is proposing to convoy supplies halfway or all the way across the Atlantic. Bombs are once more falling on neutral Ireland tonight. Several were dropped in County Wexford, 60 miles from Dublin, and magnetic mines were dropped in Irish waters this morning. 5 Irish areas were bombed last night with explosive and incendiary bombs. The Irish Department of Defense announces that one of the bombs bore German markings. 3 Irish civilians were killed and a number were injured. German bombers raided Liverpool last night, and it is possible that some of them lost their way and thought that they were dropping bombs on England. It is hard to see what the Germans would gain from a deliberate attack on Ireland. If Ireland is to be bombed anyhow, she may decide to let Britain use her ports as bases, and that would be an enormous help to British defense against submarine attacks. The German government has already apologized for previous attacks on Ireland. This is the 6th time Ireland has been bombed. The British have just imposed a licensing system on Irish exports, and this makes Ireland completely dependent on Britain for her economic life. The first official admission of German help in from Italy today. Rome announces the arrival of German kings and pilots. Their purpose, as stated in Italy's official statement, is to help in the bitter aero-naval fight now developing in the Mediterranean basin. Unquote. The chief of the Italian Air Force says the German fighters should be regarded as a great Italian unit. At the same time, Rome announces that the Italian Air Force sent to help Germany defeat England has been recalled. The reason is obvious. The British shot down the Italians at the rate of 5 to 1 every time they caught up with them. They made no effective contribution to German attack. Their presence was a moral gesture to demonstrate the solidarity of the Axis. But the Italians were so ineffective as a fighting force that the Germans are probably glad to get rid of them. Now the Germans are coming to the aid of the sorely pressed Italians in Albania and perhaps in Libya. It is a fate destined to spare, and she is not interested in winning Italy's war. Germany wants to defeat England, not Greece. Essentially, the transfer of Italian fighters from the Channel ports back to Italy and the German flyers into Italy is a confession of weakness. It demonstrates the rapid deterioration of Italy's position. It represents Italy's humiliating admission that Churchill was right when he told the Italian people the other day that Mussolini would soon have to call the forces of Attila and Nazi Gestapo across the Alps to take over Italy. Bulgaria stands ready tonight to accept the Nazi invasion without resistance. This was announced since the field day by a high Bulgarian official. He told the press that if Germany demands the right to send troops across Bulgaria, the government must consent. The chances are that Germany has already confronted the Sofia government with an ultimatum. The Bulgarian premier arrived in Vienna tonight, ostensibly for his health, but it seems more likely that his trip to Vienna is in the interest of his country's health. With Turks, Greeks, and Germans mobilized on all three of her frontiers, Bulgaria has been in a state of failing political health for some time. And since the Germans have poured an army of 500,000 men into Romania, the German invasion of Greece by way of Bulgaria was just a matter of time. Germany has not declared war on Greece only because she was not ready to invade Greece. Now she is rapidly getting ready. Germany's minister in Athens is said to have delivered a note to the Greek government today. The time has also come to deliver the usual ultimatum to Bulgaria. While he is in Vienna, Premier Philip will be told what is expected of his country. What will Bulgaria do? There is nothing much that it can do. The only country that could persuade Bulgaria to stay neutral is Soviet Russia. And the only persuasion that would count with Bulgaria is an ultimatum from Stalin to Hitler that he would fight at Bulgaria's side in case Germany invades. Stalin wants to stay neutral and will not send such an ultimatum. Russia has undoubtedly suggested to Germany that she would dislike to see Bulgaria invaded, but Germany will reply that she has the greatest respect for Bulgarian independence and only intends a peaceful passage through Bulgaria en route to Greece. But there is also Turkey. The Turks have indicated more and more definitely that if Bulgaria is invaded by the Germans in an attack on Greece, they will enter the war on the side of Greece. And so, Germany's move in the direction of Greece and Bulgaria may set the Balkans aflame. Good night.
What do you want when you buy gasoline for your car? First of all, you want good gasoline. You can get it in a number of different brands. As a matter of fact, several of the leading brands of gasoline on the market today are actually superior to any gasoline available 10 years ago, including fighting aviation grade. Pure Oil has no corner on selling good gasoline, but Pure Oil's chemists and engineers have never been satisfied just to make our gasoline good. They've gone further than that. They start with good gasoline and add to it Pure Oil's special chemical combination to reduce excess carbon formation in your motor. The gasoline with this chemical bonus is Solvanized Pure Pep or Solvanized Loco Pep. It is the only gasoline with this exclusive feature. It costs no more than regular. If you believe in common sense gasoline buying, this is the gasoline for you. Just as surely as 2 and 2 make 4, a good gasoline plus something extra equals greater gasoline value for your money. Try it and see for yourself. Get it at the stations with the big blue and white Pure Oil sign. Don't forget H.V. Colson-Born Saturday. Same time, same station. Be sure with Pure. Gene Hamilton speaking. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
German aircraft carried out a number of attacks on Great Britain last night. The raids, which lasted for several hours, were scattered over many parts of the country, and enemy aircraft have been reported over towns on the south coast, the west of England, the North Midlands and the North West, as well as over the London area. There are reports from Germany that our bombers attacked industrial targets there. A bill to authorize President Roosevelt's lease and lend policy is to be introduced today in Congress.
A heavy bombardment from land, sea, and air, which began on Sunday. The British today started their attack on the Italian base at Tobruk. And this evening it was reported in Cairo that both outer and inner defenses had been penetrated to a depth of 5 miles on a broad front, and that great numbers of prisoners had been taken. In Cairo, it is expected that mopping up of the garrison of 20 or 30,000 men will be completed in a day or two. In the meantime, the British are increasing their pressure from 2 sides on Italian possessions in East Africa, though as yet with apparently small forces. In Albania, however, the Italians are counterattacking with vigor, and while they seem to have been repulsed on all fronts, the Greek advance has suffered at least a temporary check. No air raids have been reported in northern Europe tonight, though today German planes made a few nuisance raids on England. There's more trouble in Romania. Last night, a broadcast by the totalitarian premier, General Antonescu, which sounded like an appeal to the people, was abruptly cut off, and for 24 hours no more news came directly from Romania. So far as can be gathered from the reports from other Balkan capitals and Berlin, the trouble began 2 days ago with the killing of a German staff officer by a person variously described as a Greek, a Turk, and a British secret agent. Police action seems to have been slow, and the Minister of the Interior was dismissed. Then, apparently, Premier Antonescu tried to dismiss all policemen who belonged to the fascist Iron Guard. This led to rioting by an Iron Guard faction in which the radio station and telegraph offices seem to have been held for a time by the insurgents, who, according to Budapest stories, were attacked by Romanian troops and tanks. Half an hour ago came a heavily censored dispatch from Romania announcing that an agreement had been reached to end the grave situation in the capital, and that Antonescu had given the rest of the country 24 hours to reestablish peace and order. What will happen if they don't reestablish it is not stated, but since the dispatch sounds as if there had been some sort of compromise in Bucharest itself, it is possible that, as other Balkan capitals believe, the German army of occupation may simply take over the government of the country. Ernest Bevin, British Minister of Labor, told Parliament today that more workers, men and women, were needed in the war industries, and that if there were not sufficient voluntary transfers, compulsion might have to be exercised, without exception, he said, of rank or anything else. Meanwhile, the Russians are commemorating the anniversary of Lenin's death, with the Secretary of the Communist Party declaring that Russia must improve its defenses as the international situation contains possibilities of the gravest eventualities to which the Soviet Union cannot be indifferent. The British today suppressed the London communist newspapers, the Daily Worker and the Week, on the ground of persistent opposition to the national war effort. But tonight, the State Department announced that our moral embargo placed last winter on shipments of airplanes to Russia had been lifted. Ground for the embargo was the bombing of the civilian population of Finland, which of course has ceased, and the revocation is an obvious move of foreign policy. But it's not likely to give the Russians many planes, since American capacity is already booked up. Ambassador Kennedy, testifying on the lease land bill before the House Foreign Affairs Committee, favored some amendments, such as a time limit on the President's powers and the establishment of a small congressional committee to advise him. Mr. Kennedy said, however, that Congress would have to surrender some of its powers and warned against revision of the bill that would slow down aid to Britain. When asked how far we could help the British without getting into the war, he said there was a very great risk no matter what we might do, and he believed the President's policy entailed the least risk for the greatest good. And that's the news to this moment.
8:55 Eastern Time, and Columbia and its affiliated stations bring you Elmer Davis and the news.
Tobruk was taken by the British today after little more than 24 hours fighting, and all that is left is mopping up operations in the fortifications to the west of the town. The pattern of the attack seems to have been about the same as at Bardia, and it was made easier by the total inactivity of the Italian Air Force. The prisoners have not yet been counted, but apparently include almost all the garrison. Casualties seem to have been light on both sides, though one column of Italian prisoners going to the rear suffered heavily when it came under the fire of Italian guns of the inner defenses. In Tobruk, the British Navy gains an excellent harbor. Whether the advance is to be pushed further along the coast is likely to be determined, according to London reports, by the wishes of the Naval Command. In Albania, however, where the Italians have been strongly reinforced, the fighting is furious and without much advantage to either side. Around Tepeleni, fascist troops are counterattacking with great vigor, but the Greeks say that they have not yielded any ground, while their air force is vigorously bombing Italian supply columns. Beyond Klissura, too, there is desperate fighting, and correspondents on the spot say that many of the casualties on both sides are from bayonet wounds. Clearly, while the Italian counteroffensive has so far made no progress, it has effectively stopped the Greek advance for the time being. Clouds and fog have given most of England another day and night free of air raids. There were a few incursions today by single planes, and one or two have been reported over the eastern counties tonight, but it all amounts to little. The Romanian government, which appeared to have regained control of the situation last night, lost it again today, and there is much disorder and reports of serious fighting in Bucharest and in other parts of the country. Again, all telephone and telegraph communication has been cut off, and the only news that comes direct from Romania is from the nation's radio stations, which are held by the rebellious faction in the Iron Guard. Horia Sima, Iron Guard leader, has gone to Berlin, and it seems likely that he may hope to persuade Hitler to designate him as premier in place of General Antonescu. Reports come not only from Budapest, but from London that Iron Guard broadcasts are talking about restoration of the frontiers, which could be accomplished only with Hitler's permission, and this is hardly likely to be obtained. For the moment, the Iron Guard seems to have the upper hand, but whether the conflict will end in the establishment of a more extreme fascist government or in actual taking over of the country by the Germans does not yet appear. Meanwhile, the incident has had one unusual aspect. For the first time in weeks, most of the Balkan rumors turned out to be true. While all this is happening in Romania, Colonel William J. Donovan, the mysterious emissary of our government, is visiting the neighboring countries. He had a long talk with King Boris of Bulgaria today and moved on to Belgrade tonight. In Bulgaria, he lost his passport somewhere, but the legation in Belgrade is prepared to give him another, and from Yugoslavia he will return to Greece. The Japanese House of Representatives today declared its intention to support the government of Prince Konoe and to strengthen the wartime structure of the nation. Meanwhile, the government ordered a tax on bachelors and took other measures designed to increase the population to 100 million by 1960, in order, said the announcement, to maintain Japan's leadership in East Asia. And, of course, then they'll need more territory to take care of the increased population. The Japanese news agency Dome reports that Japan has offered to mediate in the border dispute between Siam and French Indochina, which has led to serious fighting in the last few days. Japanese military and diplomatic officials said that prolongation of this war was contrary to Japan's desire for peace, stability, and prosperity in East Asia. But it was indicated that the French would have to give up a good deal more territory than they had expected, and the whole affair looks very much like Hitler's mediation last fall between Hungary and Romania. Siam, if it receives an increase of territory through Japanese intervention, will naturally be much more closely tied up with Japan. In Washington, the House Foreign Affairs Committee heard two more witnesses opposed to the lease land bill, Norman Thomas and Colonel Hanford McNider. Tomorrow, Lindbergh and General Hugh Johnson will appear in opposition. On Saturday, Ambassador Bullitt will speak for the bill, and this will end the hearings before the House Committee. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee will start hearings on Monday with Secretary Hull, the first witness, as he was in the House. And Senator Barkley, the administration leader, now predicts that it may take 2 months to get the bill through both houses of Congress.
This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
8:55 Eastern Time, and Columbia and its affiliated stations bring you Elmer Davis and the news.
General Marshall and Admiral Stark, heads of the Army and Navy, will be heard tomorrow by the House Foreign Affairs Committee on the lease land bill. This was announced this evening after the committee had heard testimony against the bill from Charles Lindbergh and General Hugh Johnson. Lindbergh said the bill would be one more step away from democracy, and that he believed American aid to Britain was a mistake and would prolong the war without bringing a British victory, which, in his opinion, could not be achieved even if the United States went into the war unless there was an internal collapse of Germany. He said he hoped that neither side would win the war, as the defeat of either one would mean economic prostration, and he wanted a negotiated peace, though he felt that America had already lost some of the influence it might have had on the negotiations. He added that he doesn't like many things that are going on in Germany, but believes that over a period of years, one side is as much at fault as the other. Testifying in the field in which he is an expert, Lindbergh said the transoceanic bombing of American cities was possible, but that while it could do considerable damage by peacetime standards, it would have a negligible effect on our military position. He believed the United States was in no danger of invasion so long as we had an army, a navy, and an air force of reasonable size. reasonable in the case of the Air Force, meaning 10,000 first-line planes with reserves. General Johnson said he was in favor of helping the British insofar as it would contribute to the defense of the United States, but that he was opposed to this bill because it would tie us up too much to British policy. And he said that if we were not careful, we'd be in the war in anywhere from 1 to 3 months, perhaps on the west coast of Africa. Former Undersecretary of State William R. Castle will also testify against the bill before the House hearings close, which it is hoped will be Saturday night. Also in Washington, Defense Commissioner Leon Henderson warned the lumber industry that unless prices were reduced and deliveries speeded up, some of the government's powers of compulsion might have to be used. And the Senate committee investigating campaign expenditures reported that national and state party committees spent in the late election for the Democrats a little over $6 million and for the Republicans just under $15 million. This, however, does not include expenses of county and local committees or much of the money spent individually for advertising. And Senator Gillette, chairman of the investigating group, said that the total expenditures in the campaign might have run as high as $50 or $60 million. Overseas, the British report more than 20,000 prisoners taken at Tobruk, and they estimate Italian killed and wounded at only 2,000, while they say their own were not more than 500. Low as this figure seems, it is more or less corroborated by reports of correspondence with the Army, as it is evident that there was little hard fighting. British motor patrols have now pushed as much as 100 miles to the westward of Tobruk, but it is still uncertain whether the advance of the Army will be pushed much farther. In Albania, the Italians again attacked the Greek central column in great force, preceded by a bombardment by successive waves of planes. But the Greeks say they were thrown back, and Rome claims no more than that heavy losses were inflicted on the Greeks. The British Air Force bombed Berat in Albania and also Italian bases in the Dodecanesus and at several points in Sicily. In northern Europe, too, the British have done most of the work in the last 24 hours. Last night they bombed Dusseldorf and surrounding towns in the Ruhr area, and today they attacked the French Channel ports. Meanwhile, London and most of England are having the fourth successive night with no raids at all, so far reported at any rate, although single German planes attacked a few points on the east coast today. In Romania, Premier Antonescu appears to have regained complete control of Bucharest and is broadcasting to the country that the rebellion has ended and everybody ought to go back to work. Reports from neighboring states, however, indicate that there is still disorder in the provinces. The settlement seems to have been due to an agreement between the Prime Minister and the Iron Guard leader Horia Sima, as a result of which Sima's faction will get a considerable share in the government. And the German news agency rather dryly reports that hereafter the government will consist of reliable and capable men. German newspapers are blaming the uprising on the British Secret Service, which had not heretofore been supposed to have much influence with the Romanian Iron Guard. But all the publicity in Romania itself throws the blame on radical and communist elements, which are said to have infiltrated even into this Romanian fascist group.
This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
Good morning from the NBC Newsroom in New York. This is the 520th day of war. Our staff of American reporters in Great Britain are first today with the late news in England. Go ahead, London.
This is London. Ed Doyce speaking. The daylight raids on London grew more vicious this morning. The third alert is now on, and a lone plane has just sent down a stick of heavy explosives which could be heard in the heart of town. There were casualties because few people allowed their daily work to be interrupted. In the murky weather, the lone raiders shot out of the clouds and disappeared in a flash. One apparently attempted to machine gun a barrage balloon. The AA gunfire is spasmodically heavy. Mr. Wilkie missed it because he is on a secret trip inspecting defenses. The morning papers publish copious extracts of Hitler's speech. The comments in all may be summed up as confident contemptuousness. The speech, says the Labor Party's Daily Herald, was a caricature of reality. Pure fantasy, but fantasy with a purpose. Whenever the Führer sounds most nearly mad, there is most method in his madness. It must be for his own war-weary folk that he is building this new myth of a quick peace. The Daily Herald maintains that Hitler made his 8th mistake of the war yesterday. He threatened America. He threatened sea attack. You may anger Americans, the paper says, but you can't scare them. Swiftly, Roosevelt gave Hitler evidence of that by releasing the text of his week-old message of friendship to Halifax. The Evening Standard today notes one new thing that Hitler said. We are all Jews now. Thor, Odin, Wotan, and all the other gods are shuffled off their pedestals. Hitler now appears in the full garb of a European revolutionary, the savior of a continent against the intrigues of Jewish potentates of Britain. It is subtle propaganda and not ineffective even here. The confidence of the British people is strikingly expressed in the fact that 24 hours after the thunderbolts hurled from Berlin, the discussion of peace aims and of the British social order after the war continued unabated. Geoffrey Mander, the Liberal Party firebrand in the House of Commons, tabled a 6-point motion asking the government to declare that it is fighting to restore freedom to all peoples overrun by Nazi or fascist aggression, to supply food to all peoples immediately after an armistice and the evacuation of occupied territories, to set up a world organization against war, to build a new social order, and to refuse to negotiate with the present regimes in Germany and Italy. At the same time, Maurice Healy, the well-known Irish Catholic lawyer, says in an article that world events have progressed so far that the best, quote, we individualists can hope for is a limitation of state interference, unquote. The nationalization of railways, banks, and mines he foresees as unavoidable. A few have enjoyed, he declares, what was meant for everyone. And while I would compensate existing owners, I can see no spoliation in depriving them of what was never intended to be theirs. The government, of course, doesn't see things that way as yet. But it is surprising how many voices are being raised in the financial district in favor of a comprehensive financial and economic plan in order to prosecute the war more effectively. These voices will, no doubt, be fortified by the announcement that the government will shortly ask the House of Commons to vote another war credit of probably $4 billion, like the last credit 3 months ago. If the present rate of war spending of $36 million a day is maintained, the new credit would easily last out the fiscal year, which ends March 31st. The House will also be asked to vote a supplementary civil budget of about $1.5 million. The recovery of British exports in December of 12.5% over the wartime low level in November is regarded as cheering both from the foreign exchange point of view and the military point of view, since it indicates the extent to which the U-boat menace was circumvented in that month, though it was not one of intensive activity. The mass of the people, nevertheless, are still in the lead in demanding more sacrifices. They want to live, but above all, they want to work for the war effort. Another restriction was imposed today. Horses were put on ration cards in response to a chorus of protests that these nice animals were taking food out of the mouths of the people. Horses lucky enough to work for undertakings of national importance will not be rationed, but racing and riding horses cannot eat all the oats, bran, and beans they might want. Every animal now is rationed as to the quantity or quality of food. Hay and straw are not yet rationed. This is London, returning you to the National Broadcasting Company in New York.
That's the report from London this morning. From the Associated Press, this dispatch dated Rome. The Italian High Command announced today that fascist forces had abandoned Derna and had withdrawn to the west and south to avoid being surrounded. The Daily War Bulletin also reported that German planes, which have been reported cooperating with the Italians in the Mediterranean, had bombed the Suez Canal yesterday. Next, our report from the Reich. Go ahead, Berlin.
Hello, NBC. This is Theodore Knaut speaking from Berlin. Yesterday was a busy day for interpreters in Berlin, for the Hitler speech, which lasted over an hour and a half, was immediately translated into 31 foreign languages and dialects, and broadcast from here all over the world. It is being repeated today for the benefit of anybody who may have missed it yesterday. Listening to it myself on the radio at home, and without all the trappings of the unannounced meeting at the Sportspalast, which was nevertheless filled to capacity, I found myself comparing it to the many other Hitler speeches that I have heard, and I was struck particularly by the increasing use he has been making of irony and sarcasm in his more recent efforts. An example is his challenge to the British to let him know in advance where they intend to land to begin an invasion of the continent, as he would in that case evacuate the country, where they disembarked, and then they could speak to them in the only language that they understood, he said. The bait set on Mittag singles this out as a particularly effective bit. Hitler once more dissected British plans for social reform and scored the British capitalists and plutocrats, on whom he vented his scorn with his usual bitterness to the great applause of his audience. On looking back at the speech as a whole, I find that the passage that stood out the most was the one that the papers here headline as a warning to America, the part where he said, referring to Britain's position, quote, "What is it that they hope for? For help from elsewhere? From America? I can only say that we have allowed for every possible contingency in advance. That the German people has nothing against the people of America is clear to anyone who does not twist the truth on purpose. Germany has never represented interests in the American continent other than when Germans took part in fighting for its freedom. If any state on that continent should now attempt to take a hand in the European conflict, then the aims of the fighting would change still more rapidly. Europe would then defend itself. Let there be no doubt about it. Anyone who thinks he can help England must know that every ship, alone or accompanied, that shows itself in front of our torpedo tubes will be torpedoed." End quote. In official circles, by the way, this is interpreted as meaning within the war zone area, which Germany has declared in the waters around England and far out into the Atlantic, and not anywhere else on the high seas. Outside the above passage, there was no reference in the speech, directly or indirectly, to the United States, and it is especially striking that there was no attempt made to reply to President Roosevelt. This reticence has been the subject of comment in diplomatic circles here, I understand. England will be struck wherever she shows herself, Hitler also said, and this has been interpreted as a reference to a possible offensive in the Balkans, it being said that it was the other side that first spoke of the Balkans as a potential theater of war. There was, of course, no hint given of an attempt to invade England, but an increase in the submarine war was promised in the spring also of aerial attacks. There's no further word from Vichy, but the German ambassador Abetz has returned to Paris after having met with all the people here who are in touch with the situation there. The attacks in the Paris press on the Pétain government are being continued and are becoming sharper. Military news of the day, as reported in the German communique, is concerned mostly with an attack on London yesterday, in which planes were destroyed on the ground and a munitions dump was blown up. Factory buildings were destroyed east of Cambridge, in Stortford and Nottingham. A submarine sank 20,000 tons of enemy merchant ships, and planes 250 miles west of Donegal sank a small vessel and a smaller one off the mouth of the Humber. The British made no attempts to fly into Germany, but German chasers destroyed a dozen British balloons over Dover and London. This is Theodore Knaut speaking from Berlin and returning you to NBC.
Next, we take you to Earl Godwin for the late news on Capitol Hill, reported from the NBC newsroom in Washington.
Good morning, folks. In contrast to that interpretation of Mr. Hitler's speech, which you just heard from Berlin, you may have noticed that Hitler's threat to fire his torpedoes into any American aid that comes his way has not stopped the program here. The Lend-Lease bill, curried and combed and ready for a week on the track in the House of Representatives, was reported out favorably by 17 out of the 25 members of the Foreign Affairs Committee. 3 Republicans voted with the Democrats. 1 Democrat voted with the minority. The general attitude of the solidly organized Democratic majority in the House is that this superlative overall legal authority to get, make, and give all possible American aid to beleaguered democratic countries without bothering about the pay is the best way to keep out of the war. Well, on the other side of the House, the Republicans have not yet crystallized into any party or partisan policy, although the opposition to the bill will be led by Republican member Hamilton Fish of New York. My own rather hasty cloakroom view is that not one Republican out of 5 has made up his mind whether or not to support or oppose the bill in the final vote. One reason for this inconclusive state of mind is that most Republicans favor aid to Britain, but they're not quite sure on the manner of giving the aid. for instance, give Britain a credit out and out of $2 billion and let her continue buying and taking it away as at present. That's the view of one particular leader I talked to yesterday. Many Republicans do not like the grant of vast power to the president, in spite of the administration's argument that the bill does not grant powers not already granted by the Constitution or by existing law. The president, for instance, they argue, does not need any more law to send the United States Navy wherever he pleases around the world, as Theodore Roosevelt did. At any rate, on this subject, the House Republicans intend to confer this afternoon, the meeting having been called by their leader, Joe Martin, Representative Martin of Massachusetts, who, incidentally, has announced that he will resign as chairman of the Republican National Committee. You know, this government's highest officials have been very determined in their antipathy toward the so-called aluminum trust. Despite the statement of aluminum officials that there is no conspiracy to keep production down and prices up, there is a growing feeling in administration circles here that someday something big will break over the heads of the aluminum producers. Well, now comes the charge that the so-called aluminum trust has worked up a deal with the German Die Trust to control and keep down the production of the metal known as magnesium. That's something about a third lighter than aluminum and is essential in the manufacture of airplanes and bombs. The effect of this control, it is alleged here by officials, is to slow down the production of airplanes, and so an indictment against 6 companies and 9 officials is lodged before a federal grand jury in New York and announced here. Meantime, in other quarters, Washington hears the charge that labor troubles are stopping defense production. Donald M. Nelson, an official of the Defense Commission, warns industry to cooperate willingly or else. And while Donald is thus threatening government action by priorities, Representative Leland Ford of California charges on the floor of the House that certain elements in organized labor have deliberately slowed up defense production. Ford charged that Sidney Hillman, CIO official, equal in production rank with Mr. Knudsen, is chiefly interested in CIO and is utilizing his post to wage war on the rival American Federation of Labor. Earl Godwin says goodbye. That's the news from Washington at this time.
Earl Godwin, who has just been heard from Washington, and our staff of American radio reporters abroad, bring you the news each weekday morning at this same hour. Listen to our regular news broadcasts and keep abreast of history in the making. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
It's time to listen to the NBC Newsroom of the Air.
Good evening, everyone. This is John W. Vandercook in New York. Tonight, the newsroom takes you first direct to England. Will you go ahead, London?
This is John McVane in London. London has had no air raid alarm tonight, and no raiders are reported over Britain. But during daylight, 3 alarms were sounded. German planes, flying singly, attacked the capital from different directions. They ran over fast, hiding in the heavy cloud formations that blanketed the entire area. It's officially stated that 2 of the German planes were shot down. The raiders were the light, fast fighter bombers that can carry light bombs and depend on speed and cloud cover to escape defending fighters. Some of the raiders stayed up in the clouds to drop their bombs, but others sounded as though they were diving down below the clouds occasionally to get a quick look at the ground. High explosives and firebombs were dropped here and there, and the attacks were widespread. To most observers here, this type of raid seems to be a rather senseless one. The bombs are light and seem to be scattered by pilots who are in such a hurry to get rid of their load before they run into British fighters that they don't take the time to pick out an objective and plaster it with 3 or 4 well-aimed shots. In one residential section of London, we heard a bomber getting rid of a stick of 4 bombs. The first was a fair distance away. The second was closer, and by that time we were flat on the floor waiting for the third. You could tell they were light bombs with the whistle and the explosion. The third and fourth were fairly close. Then we heard the sound of the plane's engine growing fainter, and we knew then it was all right. Just outside, some workmen were putting up a new building. When I got to the window, the foreman was yelling at some of his men working at a cement mixer. He was half angry and half laughing. He was saying, "With that machine making so much noise, you'll never hear them coming down until one drops inside." The front of his suit was dusty, as though he, too, had been lying on his stomach. Later, I went out to see where the bombs had fallen. One struck the sidewalk at the corner of a narrow alley. A mews, they call it here. The bomb had made a hole only a few inches deep and 4 or 5 feet across on the hard pavement. It had blown in the windows of several houses, and people said one person had been killed. Another bomb had knocked part of the roof off an empty house. I was told the fourth bomb had hit a small neighborhood shopping street and killed and wounded 2 or 3 people. That's about all that raids like today's do. Kill a few people and wound a few people. And as far as one can see, they have precisely no effect on wrecking the British war effort or the morale of the Londoners. Because people nowadays don't pay an awful lot of attention to daytime raiders until something falls right next to them. Mr. Wendell Wilkie inspected defenses on the southeast coast today. Afterward, he said he thought the Germans would have a tough job if they try an invasion around where I've been. He saw anti-aircraft guns at Dover fill the sky with bursting shells when a German raider approached, and he also saw some of the big coast defense guns fired. Mr. Wilkie has been getting all the headlines in the British press, but Mr. Harry Hopkins, in a quiet way, has been carrying out a thorough investigation of affairs in this country. He is on noticeably friendly terms with Mr. Churchill, and today he accompanied the British Prime Minister on a tour of Southampton and Portsmouth. This is John McVeigh in London, returning you to the National Broadcasting Company in New York.
And now for the news direct from Italy. Go ahead, Rome.
Hello, NBC. This is David Anderson speaking from Rome. The recent Hitler speech has brought our attention around once more to the final drive which the Axis forces will attempt on the British Empire. But in retrospect, it is interesting to follow the development of Italian opinion, at least during the last few weeks, in view of coming events, which, according to Hitler, will culminate in a final Axis victory this year. When Italy entered the war, it was generally agreed that at least a portion of its fighting would be over in a few days or weeks at most. The Italian people at that time were riding the crest of a wave that suddenly broke, leaving the Italian people and armed forces face to face with a tougher enemy than anticipated. However, for a short time, it looked as though certain victory were in the bag for the Italians, and the reverses suffered in Greece were looked upon as only temporary setbacks, which would be compensated for by a final crushing blow at the Greeks. And yet this crushing blow was not so far materialized, and Mussolini was only too quick to sense that any hopes of a sudden victory were futile, and to tell the Italian people that they must expect a long, hard struggle. They looked with envy on the wide expanses of the British Empire. They remembered Versailles, and any measures, including a long, hard war, seemed justified. For some time, the Italians felt confident of their own self-sufficiency. It was our soldiers, our Navy, our Air Force who would bring glory to Italy. And yet, let's move the clock forward a little. After many weeks of hard fighting, the Italians are now in Albania and not in Greece, in Libya and not in Egypt. For a while, it looked as though the British were invincible, and then came word that German airmen were on their way down to Italy to assist the Italians in their fight for control of the Mediterranean. This temporarily changed the complexion of the war in this immediate vicinity, and now we heard more of Axis collaboration. Almost at once, Italian spirit took on new life, and the term Axis seemed to have teeth. The quick English drive in Bardia, Tobruk, and Derna were interpreted here in Rome as mere political campaigns without much military significance. Following the recent Hitler-Mussolini meeting at Berchtesgaden, the statement issued by the Italians that the effects of this meeting will be felt shortly is looked upon with anticipation by the Italian people. More and more, the eyes of every Italian are turned toward Germany. Their hopes are pinned on Axis cooperation, but where this will come first is as yet unknown. So from the Italian point of view, I think there is only one thing which bears real watching, and that will be to see where Axis collaboration is next felt. If the big drive on the British Isles is successful, there is an outside chance that the Italian position will automatically be alleviated. There is also the possibility that the Axis may strike at other points of the empire before making any serious threats of invasion. Some neutral quarters in Rome are even of the opinion that an invasion will not be attempted at all. The answer to these questions is known perhaps only to two men, and it's a certainty they won't tell. This is David Anderson returning you to the National Broadcasting Company.
And now the newsroom here in Radio City in New York takes great pleasure in introducing a familiar voice and a familiar personality, Mr. Fred Bate, the chief of the National Broadcasting Company's London office, and the only American radio reporter who has the distinction of having been wounded in action by a Nazi bomb. Mr. Bate is now sitting here beside me, looking, I am glad to say, very well indeed. He has just come from Europe by clipper plane and has only been in this country for 5 hours. And now Mr. Bate is going to talk for a few minutes with the members of his staff back in London. As I have said many times before, will you go ahead, Fred Bate?
Thank you. It's the first time I've heard you say that at this short range. Hello, John.
Fred, how are you?
Well, I'm grand. How's Miss Boutwood?
Well, she's right here.
And Miss Peart?
Fine, thanks, Mr. Bate.
Well, that's good. Have you got that new office yet?
Yes.
Yes,
All
all
right.
installed.
Well, all right. You let us know where it is eventually.
Yeah.
Look here. Will you tell, first of all, give my best to all of my friends there on the BBC.
Yes,
and
certainly.
give my best to Ed Murrow of Columbia, will you? Tell him that I hope we'll be doing some more trips very soon now.
He left a message to you, Mr. Bate. He's just gone out. He said give you his best if we heard from you.
All right, grand. We had a good trip on the Clipper. They expected to be a rough one. It wasn't. We broke the record from Horta to Bermuda, in spite of heavy headwinds all the way. There's one thing that I want to talk to you about, John.
Yes, Fred.
I think either Miss Bartlett or Miss Peart will know how to get hold of him. I told the men in the NBC newsroom here about that young Frenchman. I think he was 18 or 19 or 20 years old, who built or reconstructed an old plane and managed to flop it across the channel some way and land in England. That's all he wanted to do.
Yeah.
They'll remember about him if you don't.
Yeah, I remember.
Well, now they're interested, and will you try to get hold of him and invite him to do an interview with you?
Yes, I will, certainly.
If his English isn't...
Does he speak English, Fred?
Well, I think he speaks a little, but you can mix it with French
Mm-hmm.
and interpret as you do the interview.
Yes.
There's one other thing. Tell all our friends there, will you, press and radio, that the one thing that's impressed me here, in the few hours that I've been here, is that everybody over here feels that both press and radio have kept the people of this country very well informed about what's going on in England.
Well, that certainly makes us feel fine, Fred, you know.
Well, you tell all our friends about that.
Yes, we will.
And the best to all of you.
Thanks very much, Fred.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, Mr. Bate. And now for a short news bulletin. Word has reached Vichy tonight that Thailand, with whom the fighting in Indochina has stopped for the moment under an armistice agreement, has now submitted its demands. They are heavy. As the price of a negotiated peace, the Siamese are insisting that the French give up almost as much territory as Siam might have expected to gain by an out-and-out victory. Thailand asks that France hand over to her practically the whole of the big southern province of Cambodia, nearly 1/4 of the whole large colony of Indochina. The Siamese government has also proposed another clause, which they want included in the treaty. If France ever gives up the sovereignty of all of Indochina to some other power, then Thailand wants a promise that she will have the first rights to still another big Indo-Chinese province. That suggestion that someday France may be completely expelled from her richest Asiatic colony has, of course, an ominous sound. What is particularly troubling the Vichy government is that Siam's extravagant demands have been submitted to the French emissaries not by the Siamese themselves, but by the Japanese, who are supposed to be acting as entirely neutral arbitrators in the settlement of the dispute. And now we bring you Earl Godwin, reporting from the NBC newsroom in Washington.
Good evening, everybody. President Roosevelt, at the White House press conference this afternoon, which I attended, got into a very good-natured verbal exchange with Blair Moody of the Detroit News, and out of this exchange, the president said he'd been told that Senator Wheeler of Montana had declared that Nazi domination of Europe is inevitable and that as a matter of self-defense, this country would have to take over Canada, Mexico, and all of Central America. The president credited this tale to the late William E. Dodd, former ambassador to Germany. The president said that Dodd, in about 1934 or 35, while he was here in Washington, had informed him of these views after a dinner which Dodd said was held at Rex Tugwell's house, where they were present Dodd, Wheeler, and Senator Glass of Virginia. Well, Senator Wheeler is not in the city for comment. He's down south somewhere, but Senator Glass was reached at his house tonight, and he said he had never attended a dinner at Tugwell's and had never dined with Dodd. Well, then there's that other story, a recent story, which has attracted a good deal of attention and violent denial. That is the report that this government is considering a trade of destroyers. The number mentioned is 20 for the big British battleship George V, which brought Lord Halifax over here, landing him in the rain, you remember, at Annapolis with a great flare of publicity when the president went down to meet the new ambassador. The Navy said that this story of a trade of the battleship for destroyers is crazy. The president today told us at his press conference that it was a story invented by a Detroit paper, and yet Clifford Prevost, the Detroit Free Press correspondent who wrote the original yarn, sticks to his guns. He says the story is right. Well, the brickbats began flying this morning on Capitol Hill when Sol Bloom, chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House, appeared before the Rules Committee of the House to get the right-of-way for the Lend-Lease measure next week. Bloom was sailing along smoothly, but he was stopped by a roar from Representative Gene Cox of Georgia, Democrat, and a member of the Rules Committee, when Bloom referred to his bill as a defense bill. "It's a war measure," shouted Mr. Cox, "and I will support it as such." Well, they got into further argument about it. You know, there's a time limit on this bill, which expires, according to the bill's present arrangement, June 30th, 1943. That's 2.5 years hence. But Mr. Bloom disclosed what has been spoken of previously, that the time limit on the bill would not affect some of the contracts made under the bill. They might live for years or they might live forever. Mr. Bloom disclosed also that this time limit would not stop the president from making contracts whose life might extend beyond that date. "They will bind this government until doomsday," shouted Mr. Cox. "And it's a castor oil bill." Republican Representative Michigan shouted, "It is all doctored up to taste sweet to the people." A bill appropriating almost $1.5 billion to run the government's independent agencies in 1942 has been passed in 2 days by the House, and efforts to slash the bill have been defeated. There is absolutely no economy about the bill in any way, shape, or form. Earl Godwin says goodbye. I return you now to the newsroom of the Air in New York City.
The announcement has been made in Athens tonight that the Greek armies in Albania have again begun a general advance along the middle northern front. A second big Italian counterattack has been thrown back, and the fascists, Athens says, have again suffered heavy losses. And that's all for tonight. This is John W. Vandercook saying good night.
Tonight, the NBC Newsroom of the Air has brought you the late news in London, Rome, New York, and Washington, and a two-way conversation between Fred Bate, chief of NBC staff in England, who arrived in New York today by Clipper, and his staff in London. This is the National Broadcasting Company.